Okay, so let's start with a short introduction. Professor Tadeusz Sławek, professor of comparative literature at the University of Silesia between 1996 and 2002, director of this university, with the double bass player Bogdan Mizerski performs essays for voice and double bass. His most important publications include The Typewriter on Jacques Derrida's Theory of Literature with Tadeusz Rachwał, Calling of Jonah, Problems of Literary Voice with Donald Westling, Man, World, Friendship in the Works of William Blake, Revelations of Gloucester, Thoreau in the Community of the World, Grasping H.D. Thoreau's in the Community of the World, Reversing the World, Sentences from Shakespeare, Departing, Never Will Rest, On the Urgency of Incompleteness. That's a long list, and I'm sure there's more which you can find online. So I'm going to stop now. Please welcome our guest. Professor, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to see everybody. It's good to see anybody these days, in fact. Thank you for the invitation. Let me tell you that I don't have anything ready-made, so that something that I could simply read at you. So I'd rather, looking at my notes, try to improvise a speech on the topic which has been announced. And as you know, thief, like a thief in the night, is one of the better known biblical quotations from the first letter of St. Paul's to Thessalonians. Well, King James's version is, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night." New International Bible reads it, "For you know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night." Incidentally, those of you who are into rock and roll would know that the Rolling Stones' Bridges to Babylon album also contains a very interesting song, sung in fact by Keith Richards with an interesting guitar work by Ronnie Wood, which is also called Like a Thief in the Night. It's one of the more popular biblical quotations. Now, why am I giving you this quote? Basically for three reasons. Reason number one, that certainly describes a certain situation which I take to be ours. That is to say, is the situation of someone who is waiting for something that is to come. This he or she is not even aware when and where and how this something is going to come. Perhaps this mysterious something or this mysterious somebody has already come because, as a thief, of course, we have a criminal operation, and in the nature of criminal operation is not to advertise its actions and its presence. So that's the first thing. It's like a virus, which is invisible, which perhaps has already invaded our neighborhood without us even knowing and being aware of this. Now, the second reason is that the very notion of the thief implicates that into the story of certain criminality and certain transgressiveness of something which is morally and legally wrong. The time of the thief is the time of wrongdoing. And this is what we think about the pandemic, that this is morally and health-wise a wrong thing to happen. However, this is not my reason number three. However, the day of the Lord, the day of the thief, in fact, is the day of the Lord. That is to say, the thief is a figure of the day of the Lord, something which we are looking forward to, a moment, the day of the Lord, that is to say, a moment which will reinstall everything that is good, everything that is virtuous, and the world will be completely renewed. The world will be different from what we have known as a world before. So we have an intriguing situation. We have the day of the thief, which in fact is the day of the Lord, the day which is on the one hand dangerous, oppressive, puts us in a situation of a certain ambiguity, if not threat, on the one hand. But on the other hand, it is also the world of the promise of the world that at the end of the day of the Lord, the world will be transformed. The Bible speaks about Metanoia Transformation. Interestingly enough, Leszek Kołakowski, in his posthumously published essay about Jesus Christ, says that for most of important and urgent problems of humanity, there are no purely technological, bureaucratic, or economic solutions. What is needed is the general transformation, that is to say, and he uses the biblical word metanoia. So in other words, what is our task tonight during the time of the pandemic? I think the time, our moral duty, and I'm saying moral duty because I think we owe it to those that has been taken ill. We owe it to those that have been taken away from us. So we cannot really let this time be wasted. We have to ask ourselves the question how to live in this time, which is very precarious and dangerous, where the very question, where the very life itself is jeopardized. And yet the question is that we have to live and we have to emerge at the other end of this time with the world, which hopefully will be different, will be whatever it means. It's up to you to define it better than the world we used to know. In other words, and we know it from our own personal experience, that our forms of life, the forms of life to which we have been used, have been stalled, if not openly shuttered. In other words, it is our duty, also on behalf of those who are ill, but also particularly on behalf of those who died because of the pandemic. It's our duty to think of what kind of form we can impose upon the formlessness of this disease which has in a way taken away our lives, at least to say, gave them or imposed upon them a completely new character, formless character. The disease which threatens the very core of our lives, not only individual lives, but also cultural lives, social lives, economic lives. In other words, how to give form to a certain state of devastation. And I'm quoting now Louise Glück in one of her essays, which does not come from the time of the pandemic, is a much earlier essay, but her postulate that it's our duty to give form to devastation. It's something that we, people working in the humanities, should take particularly seriously. You could say that in a sense we are looking for a certain form of consolation, and this has been a constant issue in the letters, in philosophy. You find it in Seneca, you find it in Cicero, the question of how to master pain, how to master loss, how to master suffering. Now, this is a crucial question. And many of these people say that, in fact, the most difficult, but the most urgent question is the question of language. How to find words, how to find linguistic forms to express pain, express suffering, express sadness, anxiety. It's not easy. The question of loss is at the center of our speech today. The loss of lives, but also the loss of forms of lives which we used to know before the pandemic started, also the loss of academic forms of life, or the forms of academic life, rather, that we used to know before the pandemic started. So, and again, I'm quoting from another essay by Louise Glück. Loss is the routine condition, the overcast day, not the eclipse or storm. So this question that Louise emphasizes so much and so frequently, loss is our routine condition, and the pandemic has accentuated this, and it has brought the question of loss as a challenge and as one of the crucial questions concerning the human condition. Now, the problem with the pandemic is that it is not to be understood, or at least it's hard to understand the pandemic in forms of one event. For us, history basically is synonymous with important big events like wars, like important historical occurrences, sometimes devastating natural phenomena like earthquakes or tsunamis and so on and so forth. Now, the time of the pandemic for all of us who are not directly ill, and I hope I'm finding all of you in good health. So for all of us who remain in relatively good health, the pandemic is the time which is the time of non-event. We are simply lying low, waiting, expecting perhaps the attack of the hidden enemy, the thief that may come unexpectedly. And we have problems with how to tell this story of non-event, how to narrate something which consists basically of, not of events, but consists basically of waiting or trying to work out some kind of forms of behavior which would address this very strange and dangerous situation. It's interesting that if you look at the history, history has always been privileging these big events. For example, if you look at the story of World War I, a very interesting book has been published by Laura Spinney. The title of the book is Pale Rider, The Spanish Flu of 1918, How It Changed the World, published in 2017. Now, Spinney's point is that although Spanish flu in 1918 has taken, roughly speaking, about 100 million lives, she checked it up through the internet and through various bibliographical services. There are 80,000 books about World War I, and there are only 400 books about the pandemic flu, the pandemic of the Spanish flu. So in other words, we have problems, and these problems are our problems now. We have problems with the difficult point we find is how to tell the story of what we are doing now, how to narrate our lives in this time of non-event for all of us who, once again, remain in relatively good health. Now, in order to find some kind of, maybe not inspiration, but some kind of point to which we could relate our experiences today, I'm looking back to the 17th century. And of course, many people today look back at Daniel Defoe's 1722 famous book, Journal of the Plague Year. But I'm going 1 century backwards to the 17th century, and I'm suggesting a look at Samuel Pepys's fascinating diary, particularly the years 1665, 1666, when England is being devastated by the plague. And oddly enough, we will find that the descriptions of the cities, for example, at the time of the pandemic in the 17th century, could really be very easily translated into the descriptions of the landscape of modern city today, as we know it, particularly from the month of early pandemic times, March and April. This is, for example, a quotation from October 16, 1665. Samuel Pepys, a very interesting character, a self-made man who from a very humble social origin worked his way up to quite a spectacular career in the Royal Navy. An early modern man on the threshold of capitalist explosion of the middle class revolution, etc., etc., etc. I'm leaving it aside. Going back to the quotation, October 16, 1665, Pepys writes down, "Here, hence I walk to the tower, but Lord, how empty the streets are and melancholy, so many poor sick people in the streets full of sores, and so many sad stories overheard as I walk." 3 months later, he's rejoiced over the streets that are slightly more animated. And he says, "The delightful thing it is to see the town full of people again, as now it is." That was a premature joy, because at the end of the same month, he says, the pandemic is back. Why am I quoting Pepys? Partly to reassure us that we are not in a totally exceptional situation. The pandemic and the mass diseases have happened before, and sometimes somewhat humanity has been able to brave the situation in the same way in which we, I believe, will be able to emerge at the other end of this disease. However, this is not my main reason. My main reason is double. First, I think is that Pepys is telling us that the pandemic is a sign of something much more serious. Pepys seems to be suggesting that pandemic is the tip of the iceberg, which suggests that there is something basically wrong with the way in which we have constructed our social, cultural, economic world. Let me give you a very interesting quotation. August 22nd, 1665. Pepys is on his way to Greenwich and he takes down the following note. In my way, seeing a coffin with a dead body therein, dead of the plague, lying in an open close belonging to the Coombe farm, which was carried out last night, and the parish have not appointed anybody to bury it, but only set a watch there day and night that nobody should go thither or come thence, which is a most cruel thing. This disease making us more cruel to one another than if we are dogs. Now, this is a very dramatic statement. This is something that we know from Poland. I don't really want to name the name of the town, which has been going through very odd things recently, but you may remember that about 2 months ago in one of Polish towns, 2 coffins were not allowed to enter the church on account of the fact that the people died of the virus. What is Pepys telling us looking at that coffin which has not been allowed to enter the cemetery, over the dead body that has not been buried by so cultured a society? And we all know that to bury the dead is the human mission, is one of the defining signs of humanity. What is Pepys telling us? Pepys is telling us this disease is making us more cruel to one another than if we are dogs. Let us leave dogs aside. Dogs are innocent. This is a rhetorical figure. Pepys is telling us basically this, to put it very crudely. We have built a system which is based on cruelty, although on everyday life basis, we don't see it. We choose not to see it. We take it for granted that things are the way things should be. Only the pandemic, the explosion of pandemic tells us there is something wrong with this construction, with the construction of the world, which we have prepared for ourselves. That's my first motivation. My second motivation behind quoting Pepys is that he has a response to this. He gives us a response. What is the task of someone who is facing the cruelty of the world, which we have constructed of ourselves and which we have, most of the time, we choose to ignore this cruelty, or we believe that this is simply the way things should go. This is a quote from January 16, 1666, when Pope says, "So home late at my letters, and so to bed, being mightily troubled at the news of the plagues being increased, and was much the saddest news that the plague hath brought me from the beginning of it." Answer to the question, what shall we do about the cruelty of the world, which we normally don't see and which all of a sudden exploded during the unusual dramatic time of the pandemic, is, I'm quoting Pepys, we have to be mightily troubled. That is to say, we have to be touched to the quick by this fact. We have to be disturbed, profoundly disturbed by this fact. And this disturbance is, of course, a crucial thing for us. We have to be profoundly disturbed. We have to be shattered as far as our conception of what are the principles upon which we have built our lives and built our world in which we live are, and so on and so forth. Now, if we then try to conceptualize it a little bit more, you could say that the time of pandemic is the time in which we, I'm quoting Pepys again, we realize that we live in a cruel world, and most of the time we choose not to see it. Point number 2, our response is to be mightily troubled, is to be profoundly shattered, touched to the quick. To translate into a more accurate, I think perhaps more modern, more immediately understood categories would be, it's time to grieve and think at the same time. Paul Giordano, a contemporary Italian philosopher who very recently published the book Nel Contagio during the time of the pandemic, tells us, I'm quoting, "The epidemic is an invitation to think. Quarantine offers a good opportunity for this. It is a chance to ponder that we are not only members of humanity, but realize that we belong to the most invasive species of the wonderful and fragile ecosystem." So in the final part of my short address to you, I would like to simply address this issue. What does it mean that we have to grieve and think? Which both Pepys in the 17th century and a contemporary philosopher advise us to do. Well, first of all, I think, and I would like to enumerate and outline briefly 5 areas which I think we people working in the humanities should take up and using possibly any text, explore these issues. I think issue number 1 would be that we need to think of the place of humanity in the general ecosystem. That is to say, we need to think of what Italian economist and philosopher Ugo Bardi famously called Seneca's cliff. Seneca is the name of the Roman philosopher. What is Seneca cliff? Seneca's cliff is the belief, Seneca cliff is the belief that, in fact, although things grow and develop slowly and needs time, Seneca discovers this truth that they decline very quickly and rapidly. That is to say, we have to face the situation that the slow growth takes time, does not mean that the decline would be equally slow. So we need to think about the place of humanity in this whole situation. And the pandemic, of course, gives us a good opportunity to do this. And let me, in fact, quote an American poet, some people say the greatest American poet west of the Mississippi River, Robinson Jeffers, who writing in 1948 says, gives us a very pertinent description of the Seneca cliff situation. He says, I'm quoting, "The civilization of Europe, the might of America, a wave builds up and it runs towards the shore, higher, higher, higher. Nothing, you would say, can resist it. It rakes the stars out of heavens. But slow was the rise, rapid the fall." I think we are approaching Seneca's cliff, ecologically, economically, with all these dramatic differences in affluence, with all the human footprint in ecology and so on and so forth. We need to address this question. We people in humanities owe this to the victims of the pandemic, to meditate and to consider this fact. What is the role of humanity in the ecosystem? Wonderful, beautiful, but fragile. In a sense, this has already been done by poets. I have just quoted Robinson Jeffers, Ronald Stewart Thomas, one of the greatest religious poets of the 20th century, a Welsh priest, writing in 1995, speaks about, in a poem called A Species, says, and I'm giving you just a fragmentary quote, he describes humanity as, I'm quoting, shipwrecked upon an island, whose intelligence, human intelligence, was sowed like a virus, a very significant word today. It led to, I'm quoting again, festivities of science, developing civilization like, quote again, their infection, until we were made to go back home. So that's my first question, and my first area which we should probe. We should think while grieving over the disease And while mourning the last word, which I used a minute ago. I think that's the second area which we need to investigate. What is the nature of home? What it means to be at home? We need to rethink this so that it would not belong to the regime of I, me, mine, my family, my country, my nation, so that it would not be a hole, a den in which we simply try to hide from everybody else and we try to scare everyone else as far away from this hiding place of ours as possible. We need to address this issue, what it means to live at home, what it means to be at home, because I think this notion of home is being taken away from us by politicians and used and abused very frequently in a very deplorable way, immoral way. So that's my second area, to investigate the nation of home, of being at home, which of course extends over into the nation, into the notion of the nation, homeland, etc., 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 etc. My third area is that we need to think over anxiety and uncertainty. We all live in the period where we feel uncertain, when we feel anxious. To what extent the world is not, we need to think to what extent, we now realize to what extent the world is not at our command, that we have to learn how to live in a state of certain incompleteness. Perhaps spirituality of culture is precisely this anxiety and the state of being uncertain. So the spirituality of culture and the way to, it seems to reside particularly in our ability to feel and experience uncertainty and anxiety as important manifestations of human spirituality, also religious spirituality, I think. That is to say, this incompleteness, this uncertainty, which translates itself into the language of questions rather than answers. And of course, this is important because all politicians, major institutions like the church, for example, are very quick in providing us with answers. And I think we need to go back to the questions. And that's why I'm talking about uncertainty and anxiety as a third important area, which we should investigate during the time of the pandemic. My fourth area would be the area of language, naturally enough. Of course, I'm talking about language certainly from the point of view of the significance of the dialogue, which, the deficit of which we witness so dramatically and so painfully in Poland. We need to think about language and the categories which we use in language as possible invitations towards dialogue, towards sharing, towards sharing the forms in which we could live our incompleteness, our uncertainty, in order to establish the culture which I can only most generally describe as the culture of openness. Whereas generally speaking now, not only in Poland, but all over the world, and of course pandemic made it even more dramatically felt, the drive is towards closure, towards building walls, like between America and Mexico, but also walls, more importantly, in a figurative sense. And I think we need to talk about language, which would be the invitation towards shattering the walls, towards making openings in these walls, rather than building these walls and making them higher and higher. We need also to meditate upon certain important categories which are used in language. For example, the category of safety. It means to be safe. And of course, you know, this is a category that has been again used and abused by the politicians. You could also argue that if the message of Christ was about security and safety, there would be no Christianity. Christianity was a challenge, was a radical openness, original Christianity, I think. So considering this and considering the fact that we have been witnesses of a spectacular collapse of the public discourse, both lay discourse, but also religious discourse, which is in a situation of a profound crisis. I'm again quoting Aristomenes, a priest himself, who says, shall we revise the language? Now that's the crucial question. That's my stage number 4, upon which we should reenact or relive the pandemic in order to be hopeful that we could emerge with something different from what we have known before the time of the pandemic about our own world, about the forms of our life in this world. So the question of Aristomenes is, shall we revise the language? And then he critically speaks about the language of the church when he says, I'm quoting Aristomenes again, we devise an idiom more compatible with the furniture department of our churches. Now, to revise the language, to make it compatible, not with this or that ideological program, but to make it compatible somehow with human anxiety, with human uncertainty, in this way addressing human condition. This is, I think, our mission today. And my 5th area of investigation would be that we need to think of law and democracy so that people would not be pacified by naked violence and force. And we all know that not only in Poland, but in so many other countries in the world, democracy seems to be in a critical situation, or at least is negotiating a very dangerous curve. So I think this discussion about democracy, about law, for example, and the way in which law should function is one of the crucial areas which we need to discuss in order to, and I'm coming to the conclusion, to the other part, the final part of my title. If we want to reach or work towards a culture of healing rather than a culture of wounding, which we have been living in for quite a long time, the culture of injustice, the culture of harm, the culture of inequality, the culture of migrants that, of course, face the closed borders. So if we want to somehow do something about it, if we want to reach, or at least try to work towards establishing a culture of healing, I think this is why I have listed these 5 areas, probing and working in these 5 areas. And of course, you may enumerate many others. This is just my own private idiosyncratic list. But this culture of healing, and I'm coming back to Louise Glück in the final part of my little short address to you, because this is her term in one of her essays. Again, it's not the time of the pandemic. The essay originally goes back to 1999, and you will find it in her collection, American Originality, Essays on Poetry, published 2017, if I'm not wrong. Louise Glück speaks about a culture of healing as conditioned by 2 things, by 2 factors. One is, both factors are quoted in a negative sense. That is to say, these are the issues which we have to address critically if we want to work towards the practice, towards the culture of healing. One is that, as she says, we live in the culture of the cult of perfect health and beauty. And we all know this. We all know all these endless books which promise to make you happy and physically fit and beautiful. And Louise Glück says that one of the conditions to establish the culture of healing is to be aware of this cult of perfect beauty and health, but also to be critically disposed towards it, because in this way, because if practiced uncritically, the cult of perfect health will destroy or will prevent us from seeing the loss the word with which we started this little talk, will disturb us from seeing the meaning and the sense of the loss. And by the loss, we mean everything that goes with it: anxiety, pain, suffering, harm, sadness, and so on and so forth. And the other factor is, according to Louise Glück, a pornography of scars. Pornography of scars, which is another list, another line of popular publications, which in fact, in which the authors declare how they have succeeded in overcoming this or that difficulty, how they have overcome the loss. It's in fact both these lines of thinking, that is to say, the cult of perfect health and what she calls a pornography of scars. Both of them are based on the vital fault of our civilization and of our culture. This vital fault is that we dramatically try to deny loss as the central human experience. As finally Louise Glück says in this essay about the culture of healing, I'm quoting, "As the power of loss is undermined or denied, so does the speaker come to seem entirely constructed and inhuman." So if we don't want to turn ourselves into some kind of automata, into some kind of machinery activated by the system, if we don't want to do this, we have to rediscover in us the ability to deal with the power of loss. Because only in this way can we overcome, or at least deal with, the trauma of the pandemic, which is the tip of the iceberg, telling us that there has been something wrong, cruelly wrong, brutally wrong, with the way in which we have organized our world. And of course, Louise Glück also, towards the end of her essays, mentions things like we have to practice, and I'm quoting her again, a disciplined refusal of self-deception, which works through insight, concentration, and a very important thing, altered perspective. Maybe that's the key lesson of the pandemic, which we owe to the victims of the disease. Altered perspective, transformation, change, so that we would not be going back to what we have known before, which we have diagnosed as a hidden kind of cruelty and brutality. In other words, my final words would be a quotation from 1987, I believe, song by Australian band, Midnight Oil. Incidentally, they have just issued a very interesting new album, again, very kind of committed album to what they describe as the original or First Nation, that is to say, tribal original inhabitants of Australia. But nevertheless, in 1987, Midnight Oil, a very committed political band, had a hit song under the title "Beds Are Burning." Ladies and gentlemen, it's hard to do something about the world in which we live in. Beds are burning. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was super interesting, and we have a lot of time for questions. I actually wanted maybe to start off with the questions because I've been kind of making notes while you were speaking, and there was there were a couple of things that kind of that I wanted maybe to discuss with you right now, and one of them was this moment when you mentioned how the times of the pandemic, how it's a kind of opportunity to rethink all those kind of, the system based on little cruelties, and how it's a kind of opportunity for us, for everyone to rethink how the system works. And because this is this is not really a question, it's going to be a comment and a question at the end. Sorry, I should have mentioned that before. so it's this, but it's not really a singular event, right? It's just a kind of, this process of waiting for something to happen, this kind of anxious waiting, and we don't really have one big thing with which we can kind of grapple with. It's just a collection of small micro events, you can say, right, leading to just one huge non-event. But I was thinking that we are already in another non-event like this, that we are already enduring a very similar crisis, which consists of those moments of, small waiting and maybe trying to rethink how the world is constructed. And I'm thinking about climate change or climate catastrophe, that this is also something that we've been experiencing for a while now, and we often experience that not as one big event, but a series of bigger, smaller events, connected, intraconnected, but sometimes disconnected completely. And there's a lot of kind of waiting for the sea levels to rise, waiting for the temperature to rise, waiting for another weird anomaly. And I have a feeling that we're not really taking this opportunity to actually rethink how the world is kind of constructed. That I'm a pessimist, and it shows, right, when in my way of thinking. But I'm kind of wondering if we look at the kind of climate catastrophe and the fact that we are not really, as a humanity, we're not really answering that call for rethinking our reality. So does that bode well for this opportunity, right? For opportunity to rethink how the world is constructed during the pandemic. So that would be my question. It's probably more of a comment, but I'm kind of wondering what you think about this maybe kind of similarity here.
Yeah, well, you've used a couple of interesting concepts, like, for instance, you also spoke about micro events. That is to say, it's not so much that maybe I have gone a little bit too far when I call the time in which we are quite literally locked up now as a time of non-events. Maybe it's better to speak about micro events. In fact, I see the micro events happening in our household right now, which is a kind of a moving thing, which something which we normally don't experience, normally don't have access to. So yes, I think the move to micro event is an interesting move. Maybe we all now need to rethink our histories in terms of micro histories of our lives. That's true. The rewriting of our personal histories in terms of micro events would be interesting, because micro events is something which would be everything that you don't put on your CV. Because if you applied for a job and you would say, oh, I have just bought an interesting new table, or I have just fed my baby. Now, this is not a kind of thing you put on your CV. So maybe this kind of, let's rewrite our lives from the point of view of events which we don't put on our CVs, would be my practical response to you. And then you also mentioned the question of climate. True, of course, you have all the right to feel pessimistic. I'm not too optimistic myself with all this coal-based economy, which Poland has locked itself down in. But it's interesting that you mentioned climate in terms of, and I would add to this the notion of denial, because there are very many people who deny this thing. As you know, so if I started with the notion of the loss and the culture which has been developing before the pandemic as the culture of the denial of loss. So I think now your comment, I read your comment as a sign that we could use the time of pandemic to somehow re-articulate our attitude towards this fragile ecosystem which we have been so invasive against, in fact. So yes, the notion of denial would again come here in a sense that we have to fight against the loss denial. We have to regain the question of loss in the same way we have to fight against the climate denial, to regain the notion of climate and to start seriously debating and doing serious things about it. Yes, okay, that's all I can say very quickly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. And of course, immediately I think about what you've just said about the denial of loss, and how in both cases, when you look at the responses to climate change, climate catastrophe, and to the global pandemic, that a lot of people are, of course, denying either or both, right? That we are not really facing an ecological disaster. We're not really facing a true pandemic. And I'm thinking that in both cases, people are actually experiencing loss, and this is perhaps their way of kind of denying it, that this is but maybe we're actually talking about different types of losses, that that there are certain types of losses people admit to, like for instance, I deny the climate crisis because this is too big of a loss for me to bear. So it's super interesting. This is not really a question or kind of a comment, but thank you for that. I really like that. And we do have a question actually from from Piotr Jędrzyk, so I'm going to read it out loud. Professor, do you think that some institutions use pandemic in quotation marks? Maybe some actually find the situation gratifying?
Could you repeat the question once again, please?
Yeah, sure. Do you think that some institutions use pandemic, maybe actually find the solution gratifying?
Of course, I don't really know. I'm just hesitating what to say, but I don't really quite know what is meant by solution in this question, in the question, because evidently there's no, in my speech, there was no hint at solution. I was trying only to hint at the way.
Sorry, I meant institutions. That some institutions may be using pandemic for their own gain, as I understand this question. So,
okay.
Governments maybe. I'm not sure. Maybe Piotr can add something to his question.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's part of the question behind the. And I'm using going back to Pepys because I cannot simply just let it go from my memory when he says we have been living in a world in which now we can see we can be as cruel to one another as dogs. And of course, again, I want to leave dogs out of the picture because dogs are innocent and they're used as a rhetorical figure here. So yes, part of the story is precisely the nature of the question. That is, a part of the story of the cruelty is that institutions, politicians certainly, obviously use the phenomenon of pandemic for their own purposes. Yes, that's part of the cruelty that Pepys is trying to describe, although he probably it wouldn't go that far, but nevertheless, we, from our perspective, from the perspective of our experience, would certainly say this. Of course, part of the story is that the use that the governments, for example, made of the pandemic could be, first of all, to show how operative they are, how good they are in dealing with the pandemic. And of course, part of the story is that the pandemic, from the point of view of the government, basically is presentable only in terms of figures, only in terms of numbers. There's no way in which the government would want or would like or could or would have language. That's important, would have language. I think our politicians have totally lost the language of empathy and understanding. So it's all translatable into the language of figures, numbers, data, which on a certain level is mandatory, and this is partly what we would expect. But there's certainly this tremendous deficit of this other language which would be able to address anxiety, uncertainty, incompleteness, etc., etc., etc. Part of the problem with modern day politics is that it has lost, or it has maybe better chosen to lose this language, because this language is not quantifiable. This is not the language which they could show to their prospective voters and says, look, we have generated blah, 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 such a figure of this or that, and compare this with what this other party has generated, which is considerably less, and so on and so forth. So I think part of the story And part of the problem lies in the language. And the language of politics is faulty because it cannot deal with what is not countable.
Thank you. We also have a question from Maria Smolinska, which is actually connected to Piotr's question. There have been gossips about the statistics of the pandemic being faked to have some kind of profit from higher rates of numbers. Do you think it affects people's perception and maybe makes them undermine the pandemic or overact to it? All those kind of fake news about statistics.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a complicated one. I'm afraid I'm not really in a position to answer this question very precisely. I could say only two things. One thing is that it has been a very banal observation that there is a lie, bigger lie, and statistics. So in fact, statistics, which is very useful, but statistic is just a collection of raw data that you can play very different games with, depending on what sort of effects you want to achieve. And I'm pretty sure that politicians know this game very well. Some of them are better at this game, some of them are less apt in this game, but nevertheless, they know what kind of games they can play with numbers. Of course, yet another interesting story is how how oddly and strangely, unless it's premeditated, I don't know, inexpert the official institutions responsible for the data are. We all know that a 17 or 18-year-old computer whiz was able to detect the absence of 22,000 infected people from the official statistics. And official statistics are produced by this powerful machinery of various, oh, thank you very much for that, by the very powerful machinery of many institutions, and still they cannot handle the situation. So unless it's premeditated, so institutions, many of these institutions are showing a deplorable lack of expertise and in a sense, ability to deal with the data they are supposed to deal with. And the third aspect, yes, of course, these data and the presentation, the way in which they are presented, certainly influence people's behaviors. This is a part of the game. Yes, of course, we construct our world, and this construction is based on a certain information and on a number of other factors which we get from the outside. And then we all somehow reconnect these various dots, and then we emerge at the end of this process with a certain vision of the world, with a certain perception of a problem. So yes, certainly it does influence people's way of thinking about the pandemic, yeah. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's important that the behavior of important people also influence people, because if very important members of the government, if I show up without masks and so on and so forth, so certainly it has a counterproductive effect.
Thank you. While we wait for maybe some more questions, I just wanted to add that I really like what you said about the language, that that our government, or government in general, they lack the language to actually discuss what's happening. Like if it's not about numbers, then they're lost, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because the politics basically deal with the language, as you said, of either what has happened or what is, whereas in fact, good politics should have the language to describe the not yet, something that we don't yet have, but something, some image of reality, some vision of reality, some vision of the world and forms of life towards which we would be going. Now, this not yet is completely absent from the politics, completely.
Okay, do we have any more questions?
If I may ask, as your co-host,
yes,
I would be interested in you elaborating on the notion of we. That is, a lot of your talk has focused on a we and the challenges, and I understand that this is a we of maybe scholars in humanities, and it is really appealing, right? Because it gives us, whoever we are, a sense of agency in the wake of this uncertainty and anxiety and loss and maybe denial. So I would be really interested in knowing how you locate this we in this larger project, especially as I think some of the we is not just thinking or rethinking loss, anxiety, uncertainty, the language that we're using, but actually experiencing loss and anxiety and uncertainty that affects our abilities to think. So it would be really interesting to hear you kind of comment on that.
Well, thank you very much, Marta. It's a very, very interesting and a very rich question, in fact. What I can say very quickly, of course, my first response towards where you have located the weight of the question, that is to say, where is the we and who's the we? Of course, my first impulse would be to say that we is the professional we, that is to say, we people working in the humanities, because basically this is what I would expect. This is what I would know from my own personal experience, of course, where I think that the weight of the profession now, not only our profession, surely, but I wouldn't be that impudent or that bold, if you like, to speak on behalf of other professions. So my first response would be, yes, we are people in the humanities, right? But of course, it's not enough. Because evidently I think that behind your question there lurks another very important and more important question about general we, that is to say, about the we of our being together. I think important part of your question is what kind of being together we have, if at all we have any being together. What is the sense of togetherness now? What is the sense of community now? Of course, the problem with this is, and that's why I appreciate so much the social protest that is going on in the streets of Polish towns these days, because I understand and I read these things as the way of working towards a sort of a collective we, which would not be the we imposed by any ready-made category, like we, the nation, or we members of this or that particular political alignment, and so on and so forth. In other words, I read these marches and the protest of young women and young men as the way in which they are groping towards working out a new sense of togetherness, which would be togetherness without ready-made identities. That's very important, because you have many politicians that would like, from all possible angles of political thought, to impose upon you ready-made formula of who you are, who is your we. So I think the vital thing is to begin with not to know what the we is, and only slowly, through common action, through acting together, work your way up towards this we of a larger community. And definitely that would be the community that do try as much as possible to avoid these ready-made labels. Particularly, let me, of course, go back. I know it's not an in thing, because for about at least 5 or 6 years, the whole world has been, in fact, ravaged by the wave of all kinds of nationalism and the rejuvenation of the nation state and so on and so forth. But let me once again go back to this document from 1950 or 1951, I can't remember very well now. That is to say, the letter that immediately after the end of World War II, Desrougemont, one of the founding fathers of European community, wrote to Europeans, the open letter to Europeans. And among other things, Desrougemont emphasizes one fact: be aware of the dangers connected with the nation state. Nation states they did many good things, that's true, but nation states are also responsible for very many ugly historic things that happened in human history. So I think that this is a very serious warning. I know it's not going to be very popular today with this wave of nationalism and the rejuvenation of the idea of the nation state, but I would be indefatigably trying to go back to emphasizing this aspect. So this we, to cut long story short, because I'm just meandering, to cut long story short, the we you are asking, this larger we, this not this we, which is the we of us, people in humanities, while the larger we is, I think, what these youngsters, these young people in the streets are trying to work their ways towards.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions. There is one longer one. I'm going to read it now from Ola Jen Olszewska. Thank you for this extremely interesting talk. It is impressive how many layers of life, social, political, cultural, this situation invites us to rethink, as you said, and to realize the cruelty of those layers that people have established themselves. Do you think that this pandemic is a moment that has a potential for some substantial change in the way the world works? Here I mean the attitudes to climate change, to immigrants, gender or race inequalities. Are the social unrest that happened during this time in the US, in Poland, for instance, some kind of symptoms of this change?
Mm-hmm. Yes, in a sense. Well, thank you for the question, because in a sense it's elaborates and enlarges on what I was trying basically to communicate in my speech. Of course, yes, it's part of our responsibility, although Marta would now ask what is our, in fact, in this context. But in fact, our, I would say, in humanities, shall we say, for the time being, our responsibility is not not to let go this time of pandemic unthought of, so to speak. That is to say, this necessity to grieve and think at the same time, is something very crucial. So to cut long story short, I think, yes, I think there is a way in which we could emerge at the end of this period with something which would be very moderately different, or at least with our attitudes, which would be at least moderately modified from and different from what they used to be before the pandemic. Whether I see the signs? Yes, I see the signs, as I said, in young people marching in the streets and claiming their rights to choose, their rights also to articulate their political views, and so on and so forth. I think this is a very positive sign. What it makes these marches particularly interesting for me, being a member of the 1960s generation, is that I feel a very similar aura, very similar way of thinking, with a very intriguing change at the end. If you remember, and of course it's something that would need to be commented upon in a much larger sense, but we don't really have time, so I'm putting it very crudely. In a sense, our final message to the world, and I'm simplifying things, was make love, not war. Now, the message of youngsters in the streets now is make war, not love, in a sense, because I see the slogans, this is war, which I understand. It's not that I'm criticizing it. So something is different. That is to say, the young people are pointing their fingers at me, saying, look, your ideas may have been correct, but you, excuse the language, you screwed up. And it has to be now, everything has to be reconceived. The same original impulse now has to be rethought, will have to be re-articulated, will have to be reenacted in a different way, and so on and so forth. And I do agree, yes, I do agree. In a sense, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, in a sense, we, the outgoing generation, are leaving you the world in a state in which it is now, yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question from Kate Sticker. What are the questions that we should be asking our students to help them think more deeply about the losses that they are experiencing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good one, really, very practical, and that's a very good one. Of course, as I said, my list of 5 items or 5 arenas was very idiosyncratic. Each of you can produce your own arenas, build your own theaters, and ask your own questions, surely. And of course, everyone can use any possible text, in fact, as an entrance to these questions. These my 5 questions, or any other questions that you might like to come up with. So I think what we need to ask our students is, first of all, asking them questions which would help them to be emancipated, because I think many of our students, and I think Polish education generally, is not bad as far as the level of information is concerned, maybe not bad as the level of socialization is concerned. Well, minus the time of the pandemic, of course. But when it comes to the level of emancipation, that is to say, the moment where the human being becomes an independent, critically thinking human subject, acting on his own or on her own behalf, which doesn't mean egoistically, just the opposite, acting publicly and responsibly, this is a weak point of education, I think. So I think you may ask any sort of questions that would help the young person to be emancipated, to be liberated, to express his or her own opinions as opinions that come from an independent and critically thinking human subject that is not repeating information that he or she has been fed with, or is not repeating this or that social behavior that we all have been trained in practicing, but he or she would be able to act himself or herself out, in a sense, and speak himself and herself out. And you can ask any possible questions. Of course, my first question would be, what sort of anxiety have you experienced during the time of pandemic? Share this question of how you live through the sense of incompleteness, the sense of loss, sense of deficit, of closeness, of tenderness, and so on and so forth. How do you, everything's been influenced, even our most intimate relationships have been influenced. How do you deal with the lack of intimacy, of the lack of tenderness? These are crucial questions, I think.
Okay, and I think we have time for one last question, because we don't want to keep everyone more than 1 hour. So a question from Katarzyna Kielin. Professor, you've explored the notion of home. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in your stance on the idea of us physically, so to say, experiencing that feeling of entrapment in our houses. My observation is that now we've been transformed from the actors of public spaces into spectators watching natural life from the inside of our houses. Nature is the agent now. The pandemic challenges us to express ourselves almost purely by means of language and to use it more consciously.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a very important question. Of course, let me start from the very final part of this interrogation. That is to say, nature is taking command. Yes, I think so, which is not necessarily bad. We have to understand this. You will probably recall that we all know it from our own experience that normally we tended to understand nature and take nature as basically in time, notion of time itself, as serving and servicing our needs and plans. I wonder how you felt, for example, when you saw and heard people who were just about to get married and they were complaining that they cannot really get married because the marriages the wedding parties were not allowed or limited in attendance and so on and so forth. And I had a very mixed feelings about that, I must admit, because on the one hand, it's a typical response of a human being. That is to say, there is nature, but in time of nature, time passes, but this time has to serve my plans, my ambitions, my projects. There's basically nothing wrong with this. But when there comes a moment where nature, or what you called nature taking command, where nature wants to impose its timeline upon us, we feel threatened. We feel threatened, and we feel jeopardized, and so on and so forth. So I think part of this experience of nature dictating the rules now could have a very positive response, could generate a very positive response to the situation. It could be a positive result of the pandemic situation. As far as being close encapsulated in our own homes, yes, of course, this is difficult. What I can say only briefly is that the most general response was that for a certain amount of time, some people felt it as a pleasurable experience because they could dedicate more time to their natural surroundings, so to speak, to other family members, etc., etc. After a while, it was, I think it has become troublesome and difficult to bear, which sends me back to the notion, which I find, in fact, you asked about, the notion of home. That is to say, one of the most essential things about home, and my postulates about rethinking home, is that we tended to think about home and the family as precisely encapsulated fact. That is to say, the family was an enclosed unit and everything was done on behalf of the family, and this could be extended family like the nation, for example, and so on and so forth. Now, the point is that there comes a moment where this encapsulation becomes alienation, where this enclosure becomes, in fact, sort of an imprisonment. And I think we have nearly reached this situation now, vis-a-vis, for example, the migrants, vis-a-vis the refugees, but also vis-a-vis people who simply think differently from us, think different ideas and different thoughts from us. So I think the most general thing about home and rethinking home is the notion of openness, which in fact works both literally and figuratively, going back to your question. And to the final note, sends me back to the discussion that Josef Tischner had about people from hiding places. In his book on a human being, he delivers this whole meditation on people from hiding places. That is to say, people who try to desperately hide in certain holes, in some dens, trying to scare everyone away from their hiding places, protecting only what is exclusively their own. And he describes these people as basically obsessed and preoccupied with fear, and fearful people. So at least this encapsulation, this moment where the we, going back to Marta's question too, where the we ceases to be tender, ceases to be favorable and friendly, and begins to be oppressive, and begins to feel as if we were in prison, is the moment which is critical. And the pandemic, I think, helped us to define this moment and to meditate on this moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we are finishing the Q&A right now. So let me thank you once again, Professor Sławek, for a wonderful lecture. Thank you all for wonderful questions and for the discussion.
Thank you. You've got a wonderful baby in the background.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Stay healthy. Bye-bye.